Welcome, everybody, to the USC Trojans Primetime Live Show here at the Voice of College Football. I am Matt Zemek. Ethan Inman unavailable this week, and of course, tonight, Thursday, July 3rd. Tomorrow is the 4th of July, so happy 4th of July to everyone. But it is a long holiday weekend, so can imagine that you're beginning your holiday weekend plans, a deserved break from everything else that's going on, from your work, from hopefully the struggles and the stresses of the world. Hopefully you get a nice little break these next 4 days, Friday, tonight through Sunday, so 3.5 days. Really hope that you have a great holiday weekend. And because it is a long holiday weekend, let's take a break from the normal. And on the other side of the 4th of July holiday, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have Big Ten football media days in Las Vegas, and then we have preseason camp, and then the season is here. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. Ethan, of course, is going to be back, and we'll be able to really chop things up in terms of the projected depth chart and the roster and all those kinds of things. But this is a holiday, right? 4th of July, apple pie, mom, hot dogs, baseball. It's kind of like the final big summer fling before we're going to have talking season, at the media days, and then camp. And that will really, give us like the continuous news cycle, and we'll have actual on-field observations of your USC Trojans football team. So that's all going to really heat up pretty soon. Let's do something different. Let's look at USC football history. Now, I know certain things, you know certain things, we all know certain things. So not going to try and do the things that everybody knows. Let's try and do things a little bit differently here at the Voice of College Football. Obviously, when you think about USC football history in a fairly recent context, where does every Trojan fan go? October 15th, 2005, South Bend, 4th and 9, Bush push. Okay, so you know all that, right? So in terms of kind of providing more layers to USC history, perhaps trying to, 20 years later, on the 20th anniversary of this game, arrive at a deeper appreciation for what we saw that day in South Bend. What's a way to kind of take a different route to remember a game that, of course, we all treasure, we all cherish, we're never going to forget it. It was such a special moment. Lots of different ways we can go at this. So to me, beyond the obvious things, beyond 4th and 9, beyond the Bush push, and how, the Philadelphia Eagles kind of, they recognize something that a lot of other teams didn't. Another element of this game, and let's see if you remember this. I wasn't blogging about USC, but I was blogging about college football. I was with College Football News back then in 2005. Is that, if you remember, both Pete Carroll and Charlie Weiss, the two coaches in this game, they both went for it on 4th down inside their own 35-yard line. And not in the fourth quarter, but in the early and middle portions of the game. Remember that? These coaches were really going for it. And that's what added to this game early. There was the amazing crescendo late, which of course, vaulted this game into the stratosphere as one of the all-timers, not just in the USC Notre Dame series, but on a truly historic level. The end game, is really what made this contest, of course. And the fumble out of bounds and providing that one extra little piece of drama before the Bush push. But early in the game, this game was great the whole way. It was captivating all the time. It's not as though you had a kind of a slow first half followed by the extraordinary second half, which was pretty much the way the 2006 Rose Bowl later that season unfolded between USC and Texas. That first half of the Rose Bowl wasn't anything special, but that second half was just, play after play after play. But USC Notre Dame 2005, you had these coaches who were just all in, all chips in the middle of the table. And keep in mind, in 2005, just for a little added context beyond USC and beyond Notre Dame. In 2005, the idea of, spread offense, passing game, RPOs, all these things hadn't fully taken root. Now, interestingly enough, in 2005, we saw Rich Rodriguez at West Virginia with Pat White, remember him, beginning to develop those spread concepts at West Virginia. Like Rich Rod was leading the revolution. And when West Virginia beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl that season, that really seemed to give momentum to a lot of the modernizing elements and forces that would begin to become more of a regular part of college football in the next several years, leading to what we have today. That was not common, though. And so let's appreciate in 2005, when this sport was a lot more cautious and a lot more conservative in play calling. Like, for all the ways in which we might be skeptical of the analytics, okay, in today's college football world, about going for it on 4th and 1 and being aggressive and eschewing field goals, what Dan Lanning does at Oregon. Like, he doesn't ever kick field goals in the red zone practically, and sometimes it's cost him games. But like, that's been kind of a more modern kind of focus the last maybe 5 to 10 years. But in 2005, coaches specifically in the sport in general were a lot more conservative. But Pete Carroll and Charlie Weis, in that 2005 USC Notre Dame game, they were going for it all the way. And in many ways, they were kind of, maybe not innovators, but they were like pioneers. Like, they showed how to coach fearlessly. And, like, when you get into a big game, like, there's no time for being cautious, right? You're here to make statements. You think that you have the best guys. You think you have the dudes. Go ahead, make a play. And this reinforces something about great coaching. It's part of why Pete Carroll was such an amazing coach at USC. It's not just the speeches, and it's not just the culture, and those are important. Don't get me wrong. You need to be able to inspire. You need to be able to fire people up. You need to create the right culture. You need to have the accountability. You need to create the hunger, the intensity, always compete, of course. But it's also the decisions you make. Like that gets, it doesn't necessarily get underrated, but it gets underappreciated. This nuance of, decisions on game day are hugely important. Everyone understands that. But what I think people miss, this specific nuance, is that a decision, while having its own value on a strictly tactical level, like this is the way to attack this opposition, or this is the way to handle this game, on the road, middle of the season, national championship positioning on the line, et cetera, et cetera. Decisions have their tactical components, but a decision is also itself a motivational tool. It's certainly, if used right. Like, if you go for it consistently, that is a motivational message sent to your players. I trust you. I trust you in these high leverage situations. I trust you to make a play. I trust you to be big boys and to enter 4th down situations without fear, without trepidation. Let's go for it. Like, that is who we are. That is what we do. That's our identity. So culture and motivation, we tend to think of those things as words coaches say, as things public speakers tell directly to someone in the form of the English language. But often going for it on 4th down or making a specific bold choice within a game, that can be as powerful a message, if not even more so, than words you actually say. And so Pete Carroll set an example for USC. And so it's worth just connecting the dots that USC was aggressive in terms of how it approached that game in the first half. So when 4th and 9 arrives later in the game, hey, been there, done that. Like, this is how we roll. This is how we operate. We are born to make plays in these kinds of situations. So you see how that all ties together? if you are regularly aggressive, then when you get into a real high stress end game type situation, it's not going to feel as foreign. It's not going to feel as threatening. You'll be ready. You'll treat it as just another play. Obviously, we know it's not just another play. Game on the line, season on the line, but that's part of the psychology, right? That you treat every play as significant, as a chance to do something positive. Part of the wisdom of Pete Carroll. So that's my main insight from 2005 USC Notre Dame. We all remember the huge plays. We all remember the huge moments, but Pete Carroll was going for it, not just late. He did so early, and that sent a message. It was part of his competitive juice that made him and his USC tenure so spectacular. So as we recall the 20th anniversary of USC Notre Dame, 2005, that's kind of like the outside the box insight, not the conventional one on the plays that we all remember, that you all know. Like that's kind of the added element that I want to make sure we all remember from that game. All right, let's stay with USC Notre Dame, but go back a ways. And obviously, if we're going to look at the history of USC versus Notre Dame, the golden age was 1964 through 1974. And that's 11 years. And of course, I just saw John Diadamo of the Michigan channel here at the Voice of College Football just logging on. Hi, John. And hey, John's Michigan show is a powerhouse. You want to check it out. And Michigan's enjoying a lot of great recruiting news. So congratulations to John and his team over on the Michigan channel at the Voice of College Football. But just mentioning Michigan, there was Woody versus Bo, right? The 10-year war, 1969 through 1978. Well, Ara Parseghian of Notre Dame and John McKay of USC, they had their 11-year war, 1964 through 1974. And, you just go through each of those years. One of the two, USC or Notre Dame, was playing for the national championship nearly every year in that 11-year period. And USC winning national titles within that 11-year period, 1967, 1972, 1974, and you had Notre Dame winning national championships in 1966, and then in 1970, and then in 1973. So, two programs at the height of their powers, both dominating college football, usually alternating, but like USC Notre Dame was just so absolutely captivating. And we had in that 11-year period, we had each team playing spoiler for the other. When the other team was in position to either win the national championship or finish with a lofty end of season ranking, the underdog, the team with the worst record, often jumped up and either tied the game or was able to score an outright upset. USC's upset of Notre Dame in 1964, when the Irish had John Hewitt, Heisman Trophy winner, that denied Notre Dame a national championship. And so, like, USC won national titles under John McKay. It also denied Notre Dame national titles as well. So much from that 1964 through 1974 era, the ARA era, the Ara McKay era, and it just bugs me. It bugs me a lot that ESPN's 30 for 30 franchise. First off, it hasn't done a documentary on October 15th, 2005. USC Notre Dame was the #1 game that day, but we also had that Louisville West Virginia game going into overtime. We had Michigan beating Penn State with 1 second left. You had Wisconsin beating Minnesota on a blocked punt. Like, you had so many epic games on that one day. How has ESPN's 30 for 30 not done a documentary on October 15th, 2005 yet? And how has ESPN's 30 for 30 franchise also not done a documentary on the Ara McKay era, the 11-year war, 1964 through 1974, Notre Dame, USC? It's just ridiculous. And, if you're Notre Dame, you'd think, okay, well, Notre Dame, we're the most famous program in college football history. And then for USC, it's hard not to shake the idea that this is a little bit of East Coast bias, right? The U on 30 for 30, Miami got not one, two 30 for 30 documentaries. There was the U, and then there was the U Part 2. So ESPN didn't have a problem giving the U all that time and attention, but no USC Notre Dame, Ara Parseghian, John McKay, 30 for 30 all these years later. What's up with that? So that's a sore spot, but let's appreciate that. Our friends at Michigan had that 10-year war against Ohio State, Bo Schembechler versus Woody Hayes, but there was the 11-year war, 1964 through 1974, USC Notre Dame. You had O.J. Simpson and other USC greats, making their name against the Fighting Irish. Of course, you had the 24-0 comeback, the Anthony Davis game, the kickoff return at the start of the second half in 1974, the incredible USC tsunami, which set the table for the 1974 national championship. USC also beating Notre Dame in 1972. What many people think is USC's greatest team ever, that 1972 group under John McKay. They went right through Notre Dame on the road to a national championship. So USC Notre Dame, one way or the other, like Notre Dame had its own moments with a guy named Joe Theismann at quarterback. Before USC won in 72, there was Theismann the previous few seasons in South Bend. So like every year there was something really special. There were some, incredible football players who went on to make a lasting name for themselves in the pro ranks. 1964 through 1974, a very, very special time in the USC Notre Dame rivalry. Now, one more thing about USC Notre Dame before I go to other aspects of USC football history here on our 4th of July show here at the Voice of College Football. One other thing about USC Notre Dame, this is such a curious thing to me, and I wonder if the USC fans watching here at the Voice of College Football share this view. Certainly the older fans, who know their USC football history. This is where I miss Gary from Dana Point. It's where I miss Tim Prangley's dad. We had a really good thing going on that previous show, but obviously we got a divorce, so now we have this new iteration of our show, USC Trojans Primetime Live here at the Voice of College Football. But Gary from Dana Point and Papa Prangley, like they would certainly remember this, and I think they would join me on this note of appreciation that the 1978 USC Notre Dame game, it might be the most underappreciated great college football game ever. Now that might sound like a little bit of hyperbole, embellishment, exaggeration. Okay, like the most, anytime you go to the very top or the very extreme, that might seem like, way too, Matt, you're trying too hard, you're reaching too hard. But I ask you to stop and consider all the celebrated games that ESPN, Fox, other broadcast outlets will talk about. You think about like the Iron Bowl, Auburn, Alabama. You think about Michigan, Ohio State. You think about Army, Navy. And you think about specific games from those series and other series as well. Like punt, Bama punt. Alabama getting 2 punts blocked to somehow lose to Auburn from a commanding position in 1972. Like that game is very often talked about on SEC Network. Think of like Tennessee versus Florida, Steve Spurrier versus Peyton Manning in the 1990s. And think of other rivalries and other specific games within those rivalries, like the Florida-Tennessee game that gets a lot of publicity, lots of discussion, even now, roughly 30 years later, is 1996, because it was number 4 Florida going against number 2 Tennessee in Neyland Stadium. National title on the line. Like that game still kind of gets cycled through the media ecosystem, certainly on SEC Network, and certainly in other realms of conversation. When we talk about USC Notre Dame, to bring this back to USC Notre Dame, most people go right to 2005, and may I say, rightly, because that is a classic, and it's still pretty recent, and it's from this century. Why not? Why wouldn't you talk about it a lot? So I'm not lodging a complaint there. And then 1974, the Anthony Davis game. Like, that game really does seem to be talked about and referred to again and again and again. But that game also has a shelf life. And may I again say, rightly so, because that was an incredible thing. What we saw there hasn't been replicated since. It was absolutely astonishing for anyone who was alive to see it. I wasn't alive. That was 1 year before I was born. So now you know exactly the year when I was born. But I think we have a sense. And yes, Jeff Rodriguez, Ethan's not here, not available. So I'm flying solo tonight. Absolutely. And I will address Feaster's imminent commitment in a little bit. But just to finish this point, then I'll get to Feaster. How's that, Jeff Rodriguez? Thanks for joining us here on the 4th of July Eve. In terms of how often certain games are talked about, such as 1974 USC Notre Dame and such as 2005 USC Notre Dame, to me, 1978 USC Notre Dame belongs on that plane. It belongs on that same level. Like, it belongs in the pantheon of not just classic college football game, well, not just USC Notre Dame classics, but outright college football classics. And yet, how many retrospectives do you get, do you see, do you hear, do you read on that game relative to 1974 and 2005? Like, in terms of all the bandwidth, ink, newsprint, other resources, and just raw amount of column inches or on-air minutes spent discussing games, like, to me, it seems as though 1978 is far, far below 1974 and 2005 in terms of the all-time USC Notre Dame games. Think about that. Just think about all the times that you either have seen or read something about USC Notre Dame 2005 and USC Notre Dame 1974, and compare that to 1978. I don't think the math is equal on this one. I don't think we're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio. I think it's wildly imbalanced. And so people might be wondering, okay, Matt, well, the older fans might know this, but maybe, for the younger fans, what exactly transpired in this game? And so, for starters, the national championship was on the line. So, like, this game led to USC's 1978 national championship, just as the Anthony Davis game helped USC win the national title in 1974, and just as USC Notre Dame 2005 had national title implications, and USC made the BCS national championship game in that season, and part of the 34-game winning streak that Pete Carroll and the Trojans were able to form. So it's not as though 1978 had lower stakes. So let's get that part out of the way first. This was just as significant in a larger national championship context. Like, USC was playing for the highest possible prize and, of course, trying to beat Notre Dame. So it's not like this was not a 1990s USC Notre Dame game. This was not a Ted Tollner era USC Notre Dame game when the Trojans were just playing for pride and the national championship was far off the table. This was the mountaintop, like 1988, 1 versus 2. Like, it was high stakes poker, everything on the line. USC's season hanging in the balance. So the stakes were as high in 78 as they were in 74 and 2005. So start there. But now we get to the even richer part of this. And this reinforces my point, by the way, as well. What's another really celebrated college football game? I mean, obviously there are a lot of them, but one game that, once again, you hear it or you see it talked about continuously, maybe not every single year, but maybe every 2 to 3 years at some point, the chicken soup game, the 1979 Cotton Bowl, Notre Dame versus Houston. Notre Dame down 34-12. Joe Montana has the flu. He eats chicken soup at halftime. He leads the comeback in an icy frigid, absolutely brutal, nasty Dallas afternoon. He throws the winning score at the very end of the game, and that launched the legend of Joe Montana. Well, to an extent, all right? And that game certainly is part of the Joe Montana legend at Notre Dame. But several weeks earlier, Joe Montana led an incredible comeback on the road in the Coliseum against USC in that 1978 game against the Trojans. USC dominated the first 3 quarters, more or less, and then there was Joe Montana in the 4th quarter doing his thing, somehow leading Notre Dame to a late touchdown to take a 1-point lead over the Trojans. And so, so the fact that USC won this game, that Notre Dame lost this game, obviously that has a certain effect on, the winners write the history books, right? So, of course, Montana's epic 4th quarter comeback doesn't get the same play it would have gotten if Notre Dame had won that game, but it was still an incredible comeback. Like this, and this was still Joe Montana showing, everything we saw in the NFL, especially in Super Bowl 23 for the 49ers against the Bengals, and also in that, the epic 1981 NFC Championship game, the late drive to beat the Cowboys, culminating with Dwight Clark's catch. Everything we saw from Joe Montana at his best with the 49ers, we saw that not only in the chicken soup game, but we saw it first against USC, 1978. Like, this game had everything. It had the national championship stakes, and USC in the heart of the John Robinson era, charging on to trying to win another national championship. Joe Montana doing his thing, in this classic rivalry. You would think that this game would be right on par with 1974, not in terms of how historians rate it, but in terms of the amount of time and ink and bandwidth spent on this game. And also in 2005, that 05, 78, 74, like 3 unforgettable USC Notre Dame games that all belong pretty much in the same conversation. Is your experience of history and is your experience of media that you've consumed either through ESPN or Fox or the Los Angeles Times or local Los Angeles television stations and affiliates, is your lived experience reflective of those 3 games all getting the same amount of attention? Maybe, but I'm betting it wouldn't. I'm betting the answer is no. I'm betting that 74 and especially 2005 get a lot more attention than 1978. So the final thing to note is simply that, so Joe Montana does his thing, makes that amazing 4th quarter comeback, but then USC goes back down the field, and Frank Jordan, how many people know that name? Frank Jordan. Like, to me, he's a USC legend because, he was Captain Clutch. You needed a big kick. Frank Jordan was going to make that kick for USC in the 1970s. So he boots the kick through the uprights. USC 27, Notre Dame 25. And, as the editor of Trojans, where I'm fortunate to have access to an immense historic photo library, for USC football and for, just sports in general, sports photography down through the ages. There's an amazing black and white photograph. I forget who the photographer is, but it's like there are 3 Notre Dame players just plastered on the ground. It's like they've been shot in a battlefield. They're just the picture of death, just and the USC players are celebrating right after Frank Jordan's kick. So, epic game, epic players, epic names. The Joe Montana comeback kid, right? Weeks before the chicken soup game, and then USC's fabulous finish at the end to rescue a game it had almost squandered. And even if you're a Notre Dame fan who was absolutely heartbroken, this was still a special game, right? special in the way that 2005 was, special in the ways that any classic college football game is. Whether you're the losing side or the winning side, you obviously hate losing if you're on the losing side, but you realize, darn, this was an epic moment. Like this was an earth-shaking event. This is something you're never going to forget. Like, this is the power of sports. And one final note, very simply, Notre Dame, by the way, was the defending national champion, having won the 1977 national championship and wearing the green jerseys, beating USC. So, like, that was a really special moment for Notre Dame. Irish really had their fun in 1977. So the fact that this was the defending national champion against the team that eventually supplanted Notre Dame as national champion 1 year later, wow, right? All these storylines, and yet I would be willing to bet that you put 100 USC fans in a room, that and you ask them, hey, does the 1978 game receive as much coverage in print or in broadcast as 1974 or 2005? I would be willing to bet that a solid majority would say no. So 1978 USC Notre Dame, I really think the statement holds up, one of the most underappreciated great games, not just in the rivalry's history, but in the entire history of college football. All right, so Jeff Rodriguez, you wanted me to comment on the imminent recruitment of four-star receiver Booby Feaster. So, in terms of USC's recruiting momentum, I mean, I'm running out of things to say at this point, but I would just say that, USC's defense is where, we know that this coaching staff has elite chops all the way through. And, people might say, well, what about Lincoln Riley? Well, Lincoln Riley had a bad year last year. So even though he's been elite, even though he's been, he had been at the top of his game through 2022, as an offensive coach, he needs to do a little bit of repair work. He needs to do a little bit of restoration. So, to get an elite recruit on that side of the ball, I think that is the significance. That is the value of that particular story. That, that with Danton Lynn and Coach Henney, woof woof, and Rob Ryan and Doug Belk, everyone on the defensive side of the ball, that that no matter which position group you're talking about on defense, they're going to be coached up well. So when we look at the 2026 recruiting class, like every incoming defensive recruit, I have total confidence in their development. But USC, had Jordan Addison setting the gold standard in 2022, and the Trojans haven't really set the gold standard in subsequent seasons at the wide receiver spot. Now, we're expecting big things from Makai Lemon and Jacoby Lane this season, but we do still need to see them prove themselves at the highest level. We need, let's see one or hopefully both. It would be really great if they did. Let's see them perform at that Jordan Addison standard. Let's see them perform at that Drake London standard before Lincoln Riley came aboard. So raising the ceiling at the wide receiver spot, I think, Jeff, that would be the salient, relevant note to really strike and focus on in terms of the value of that particular recruitment. So that's my news assessment on those particular terms. Yeah, and so don't trust Lincoln Riley, but the thing is that if a wide receiver is really special, the receiver could help the quarterback. We often talk about the quarterback helping the wide receiver. He has this quarterback throwing him passes that's going to help him out. And obviously, it certainly didn't hurt Jordan Addison that Caleb Williams was throwing him the ball. But in some cases, the receiver can help the quarterback. And to kind of segue just to 2025 before we look ahead to 2026, Makai Levin and Jacoby Lane, they're going to need to help Jaden Maiava and make him better this year. So, if Booby Feaster does come in, high-end wide receiver, the hope is that he'll help Husan Longstreet become, that better quarterback, and will just enable him to progress that more quickly, that more fluidly as USC's quarterback. All right, folks. So, hey, and if you have other comments and anything, I'll be happy to address them. But obviously, we're looking at USC football history on this 4th of July weekend. More on USC football history. But first, a word from our sponsor. We'll be back in about 45 seconds.
You can make a difference here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link. Financially contribute to the Voice of College Football without spending a penny. Same shopping experience. It's easy. Go to any video on any channel. Go to the description section and grab the link right next to the capital letters that say Amazon. Use that link, and Amazon will instantaneously convert to your account, settings, history, everything intact, just like whatever link you use right now. No difference. Pay no attention to the product that you see right there. Just go search what you want. Don't forget the Amazon link. Thank you for your support. Sincerely, the Voice of College Football.
All right, back at it here on USC Trojans Primetime Live here at the Voice of College Football. And as we continue with our show, just want to address something else that Jeff Rodriguez has pointed out. And that is that, Jeff Rodriguez was commenting on USC flying into game locations, especially in the Big Ten, and especially in the Central and Eastern time zones, later in the week rather than earlier. So I would just say, if you missed this, Ethan and I talked about this in the previous few weeks here at the Voice of College Football, that USC should definitely be flying in on a Wednesday instead of a Thursday. And Ethan and I both said we didn't know it for an absolute fact, but our sense of the situation was definitely that USC was flying in later rather than earlier. It's something that we're definitely going to want to nail this down as we get into preseason camp. But our sense is that USC last year was flying into its Big Ten game locations later in the week rather than earlier, and like that just should not be the case. That should not be happening. And keep in mind that there's all this Big Ten money, right? There's all this Big Ten television revenue. Like, you can spring for the extra night of hotel lodging, right? Like this is part of what all this money's for, is that you can take on added expenses. You can take on a little bit of extra coin, putting your team up another night or two, so that they get acclimated to the environment, acclimated to the time zone, acclimated to everything, right? And just give them more time to breathe. Instead of if assuming USC's flying in on Thursdays, you get in on Thursday night and you basically have one day to yourselves before game day. Well, so are you doing the game plan? Are you doing the walkthrough on the field? It's kind of all crammed together. If you're flying in on Wednesday, you can then spend one day for the football stuff. You can spend one day to be tourists, to do your academics, handle your other things, and you just get to breathe. It's not all compressed. Everything's not happening very quickly. Why wouldn't you just expand the amount of time, the length of time that you spend in those Big Ten locations just to adjust to everything? You're only doing this like 6 or 7 times a year. It's not as though this, it's not basketball, right? You're not just jumping on a plane and just going right to the next game location. This is 6 road games per season. Like out of 52 weeks in a year. These are rare, select occasions. So one would think that each time you do venture on the road, why not do it right? And why not be a little bit more deliberate? And why not be a little bit more intentional? Could not agree more with you, Jeff. And I just think that like this needs to be done. This needs to be fixed, and we will see. Like Ethan and I, when Ethan comes back onto the show, we are definitely going to stay on this. We're definitely going to try and look into this here at the Voice of College Football, because that's something that really matters. I don't think it's peripheral. I don't think it's trivial. I think it's something which is very genuinely important. All right, so back to USC football history here at the Voice of College Football. There's one other rich vein of history and experience at USC which really matters, and that, of course, is the Rose Bowl. And naturally, with the Big Ten situation, the alignment there, we're not going to have the traditional Big Ten Pac-12 Rose Bowl in the format that we always knew. Of course, however, we had that kind of flavor when Ohio State played Oregon in the quarterfinals of the playoff, and so hopefully we'll get kind of that old time feeling. But like those were two Big Ten teams, kind of weird. But so maybe we'll kind of still get lucky and stumble into that old time flavor. But we know that the Rose Bowl as we once knew it no longer exists. But the Rose Bowl really is such a rich and central vein of USC football history. And so in terms of appreciating Trojan history, what can we do beyond noting the national championships and the mountaintop moments? I think that for a lot of USC fans, especially the older ones, everyone remembers Charles White, with the 247 yards in the 1980 Rose Bowl against Ohio State. Anthony Munoz, before getting picked third by the Cincinnati Bengals in the 1980 NFL draft and going on to a Hall of Fame NFL career, becoming arguably the greatest offensive lineman USC football ever produced. Anthony Munoz was leading the way for USC on that late game touchdown drive, which ended with Charles White naturally going over the top to beat number one Ohio State 17-16. Obviously one of USC's great Rose Bowl moments and great Rose Bowl wins. People definitely remember Charles White. Older Trojan fans definitely remember him from 1980. But a couple things about that game. All right. First off, there was an assistant coach to Ohio State's Earl Bruce. All right, Earl Bruce took over for Ohio State in 1979. Woody Hayes infamously but very memorably punched a Clemson linebacker in the 1978 Gator Bowl, and that was it. Woody Hayes' amazing, historic quarter-century career at Ohio State came to an abrupt end, so Ohio State had to replace an icon of the game, and Earl Bruce was that guy in 1979. On Earl Bruce's first coaching staff at Ohio State, who was on that staff? Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll was on Ohio State's coaching staff. So he was coaching against USC in the 1980 Rose Bowl, number 3 USC against number 1 Ohio State. So, one of the amazing facts of college football history. And here's another Pete Carroll nugget while we're on that subject, just a brief little tangent. Pete Carroll was also on the coaching staff of another game that affected a college football national championship in that same era. Pete Carroll was on Lou Holtz's staff at Arkansas in the 1977 season. That 77 season culminated with Arkansas upsetting number 2 Oklahoma and Barry Switzer in the 1978 Orange Bowl. And so when Oklahoma, number 2, lost that game to Arkansas, that enabled Notre Dame, which beat number 1 Texas earlier in that day, January 2, 1978. That result, Pete Carroll beating and Arkansas beating Oklahoma, that enabled Notre Dame under Coach Dan Devine to win the 1977 national championship. So like I mentioned that earlier in the show, Notre Dame winning it in 1977. USC replaces Notre Dame as national champion the next season, 1978. But Pete Carroll had an influence the 77 title race, just as his involvement on the 1979 Ohio State staff, and then the 1980 Rose Bowl, that were also part of a very special story in college football. One other note about the 1980 Rose Bowl, USC Ohio State, that was the debut on NBC Sports of Dick Enberg as the voice of the Rose Bowl. It had been Kurt Gowdy through the mid 1970s, but Enberg basically became the voice of NBC Sports in the way that we associate with Jim Nantz being the voice of CBS Sports. The guy who does the Super Bowl, he does the Masters, he does those major flagship events. Well, 1979 was the year basically when Enberg supplanted Kurt Gowdy. Gowdy called Super Bowl 13 in January of 1979, Steelers Cowboys, and that was kind of his last big hurrah. Then in the 1980 Rose Bowl, Dick Enberg succeeds Kurt Gowdy as the voice of the Rose Bowl. He would then do the Rose Bowl with Merlin Olsen, the former Los Angeles Rams defensive lineman, for the next several years. So that's another trivia item from that 1980 Rose Bowl. USC, number 3 USC beats number 1 Ohio State, and USC, not the 1979 USC team beating Ohio State, finished number 2 behind Alabama. Let's appreciate John Robinson here. John Robinson, obviously his second go around in the 90s didn't go so well. He did win 1 Rose Bowl, but his first tenure at USC in the late 1970s, we need to really, I think, appreciate it even more. And the obvious point is that he won a lot. USC finished in the top 2 in 1976, 1978 when it finished number 1, and then again in 1979 finishing number 2 thanks to that Rose Bowl win over Ohio State. So 3 of his first 4 years at USC, John Robinson finishes in the top 2. So that's hugely impressive in its own right. It would be hugely impressive for anyone. And of course, we didn't have a playoff back then, a college football playoff. Put USC and John Robinson in a 4-team college football playoff in the late 70s, they might have won the national championship each of those years, not just in 1978. So magnificent accomplishments on their own terms. And of course, you had Charles White, Heisman winner 1979. You had Marcus Allen, Heisman winner 1981 under John Robinson's watch. You had Ricky Bell, was right there in the Heisman race in 1976, but Pitt's Tony Dorsett was just a little bit better. So great achievements on their own. But then we obviously turn to the point that just has to be amplified. John Robinson succeeded John McKay. And how many times, not just in college football, but in any sport, where you're the guy right after the icon, you're the guy right after the legend. Like Ron Zook completely fell on his face trying to succeed Steve Spurrier at Florida. We saw Bobby Bowden at Florida State, and we've seen other absolutely iconic coaches. Ray Perkins at Alabama after Bear Bryant, that didn't go well at all. On and on and on and on. We get it. We know it. We understand it. It is really, really hard to be the guy after the guy. Like look at Lane Kiffin, right? Look at Lane Kiffin at USC after Pete Carroll. It's just really hard to be the next guy right after the legend. And so as we contemplate the late great John Robinson, he stepped in after an icon left the scene, and he kept that train rolling. And so, as time passes, John Robinson's first tenure at USC, to me, just looks better and better and better. It is aging like fine wine. So another thing that we need to appreciate about USC's luminous football history and those heydays, from the 1970s. All right, one more item to really focus and drill deep on as we continue here at the Voice of College Football, and that is that when we consider USC and Michigan in the Rose Bowl. Now, obviously, we know that USC usually have Michigan's number. Part of the story there is that, Bo Schembechler very rarely won the Rose Bowl. He had that one in 1981. He beat Washington, and then he beat USC that one time in 1989. But most of the time, when Bo Schembechler led Michigan into the Rose Bowl, it did not end well for him or Michigan. So you can say that, Michigan was usually playing a road game in Southern California and the deck was usually stacked against the Wolverines. You could make that argument. And of course, with Ohio State winning the college football playoff this past season, having a home game in the first round against Tennessee, that boosted the argument from old time Big Ten fans. If playoff games were played at Ohio State or at Michigan or at Penn State won a first round game against SMU. If the playoff games were in the Midwest, maybe the results would be different. And it's a valid point. Like, I'm not arguing against the point. It's real. It's relevant. It's one of the great what ifs of college football history. That these games were always being played in USC's backyard in the Granddaddy. But nevertheless, there was a football game. It had to be played. The teams on the field had to earn their way. It's not as though being in Southern California kind of guaranteed that USC was going to win. Like, it was an advantage, being able to sleep in its own bed. But USC still had to go out there and play. And of course, it didn't always work out well for USC in the Rose Bowl. Lost in 1969 and 1974 to Ohio State. Did lose to Michigan, as mentioned earlier, in 1989. But most of the time, USC was able to bring it in the Rose Bowl, and specifically in the Granddaddy. When USC went up against Michigan, can we just appreciate for a moment how amazingly consistent USC's defense was in these particular games against the Wolverines? That was pretty remarkable. 1970 Rose Bowl. So that's Bo Schembechler's first year as Michigan's coach. The epic 1969 upset of Ohio State that launched his career and his legend at Michigan. USC wins that 1970 Rose Bowl 10-3. All right. USC and Michigan reunite in the Rose Bowl several years later. USC had played Ohio State in three straight Rose Bowls, 73, 74, 75. Well, Michigan gets back to the Granddaddy in the 1977 Rose Bowl. Final score, USC 14, Michigan 6. And then 1978, it was Washington versus Michigan in the Rose Bowl. USC and Michigan reunite in 1979. Final score, USC 17, Michigan 10. Now, there was a disputed USC touchdown. It shouldn't have been a touchdown. There was a fumble on the 1 yard line that was called a USC touchdown. So, Michigan fans, I'm not arguing with that. You were right. But nevertheless, Michigan did score just 10 points. And so it's not as though Michigan's offense really flourished in that 79 Rose Bowl. So 1970, 1977, 1979, Michigan never scored more than 10 points against the USC defense in a Rose Bowl game. And so that's, it was 3 games. So kind of a small sample size, but, 9 years apart, and Michigan could never really crack the code against USC's defense. So part of that, Marv Goo, right? One of the great USC legends, just made sure, he was a skull crusher. He was the guy who created accountability in the room. He maintained USC's culture. He was there under McKay. He was there under Robinson. And that was part of the reason USC had such great continuity in that era and in that transition. So USC, not just beating Michigan all those times in the Rose Bowl, but always doing it with amazing defense. like USC's defense never really had an off day. And so, to not have an off day in the biggest game of your life, the biggest game of your season, the granddaddy, everyone watching on television, the focus of the whole college football world being on you, and your defense is always able to answer the bell again and again and again and again like that. That's another really special part of the USC football legacy, how the USC defense just never really wavered when it went up against Michigan in the Rose Bowl. All right, so let's close our show not with football history, but just with a little brief overview of the Big Ten, since that's part of the new world that USC's living in. And obviously, we'll drill deeper into these points as we get closer to the season. Ethan and I are going to look at specific opponents on the schedule. We've spent a little bit of time in the past few weeks talking about how that Illinois game in Week 5 is really a hinge point for the season, a first really big early season measurement. It's a measuring stick of where the Trojans are and how good they really are. So we're going to have more on Illinois later this summer, and obviously, with Big Ten Media Days being in July 22nd through 24th, we're going to have something before those media days and after those media days as well, as we kind of ramp up our coverage and we get a little bit more specific, a little bit more intentional in our focus on USC football here on our USC channel and USC Trojans Primetime Live. But just in general, before we talk about these various teams in depth, I think the consensus in and around the Big Ten, and maybe not a unanimous consensus, but a majority consensus would say that this is going to be primarily a Penn State-Ohio State duel. It could, Michigan could get in there. Obviously, how quickly can Bryce Underwood as a freshman develop? If he is the real meal deal, if he is above and beyond at a level that, I think Michigan fans are high on him. I don't know if Michigan fans are ready for him to dominate in year one. But if Bryce Underwood is this above and beyond transcendent star, then you obviously throw Michigan into the middle of the mix in the Big Ten. But if you don't get that, then it's most likely a Penn State, Ohio State battle at the very top of the Big Ten. Ohio State, loses something at quarterback this season, at least most likely, but is still loaded at all the positions because Ohio State has the recruiting machine, has the resources to get pieces in the portal to replace what it lost. And Ohio State has it's become one of the best wide receiver programs in the country. So even if the quarterbacking might not be at that same level, the receivers are going to be so good that's going to, probably stitch together the passing game to the extent that Ohio State could still be a factor. And of course, with Ohio State, we saw this last season. Ohio State can stumble a couple times, still make the playoff. And if everything's ready to roll in December, in the middle of December, and all that you get all that talent on the same field at Ohio State in a playoff situation, the Buckeyes could be a really tough out. They proved it last season. So Ohio State going up against Penn State with Drew Aller coming back, with Jim Knowles leaving Ohio State as defensive coordinator to go over to Penn State. So Penn State really is pushing all its chips into the middle of the table. This is it for James Franklin. Some people might say national championship trophy or bust for James Franklin. Reasonable. I would say national championship game or bust. If Penn State can at least go one step beyond what it did last season, this season is going to be a failure. Another semifinal exit, that's going to be pretty empty for Franklin, and he might not get as good a chance to win the national championship as he will have this upcoming season. And then you might be wondering, where's Oregon? And very simply with Oregon, why I don't think Oregon exists on the same plane as Ohio State and especially Penn State. Penn State being my pick to win the Big Ten, and Ohio State probably to be the number 2 team. Dante Moore. Dante Moore, he could be good. He could be really good, All right. So I'm not going to write this guy off, but I certainly am going to enter this season saying, you know what? Prove it. Show me you're good. Show me you're ready. Show me you're up for this until we get a substantial bed of proof, of supporting evidence that Dante Moore is the real meal deal. I think you have to put Oregon a notch or two below Ohio State and Penn State. So Michigan, Bryce Underwood, that's the big variable there. And at USC, it's not just Jaden Maiava, it's also can this offensive line, coached by Zach Hansen, replacing Josh Henson, can Zach Hansen show that he is this elite skull crusher offensive line coach for USC? Can the Trojans become what they were? And like that, this kind of ties things together, right? We've been talking about USC football history. Let's travel back in time to the late 1970s. If USC can have that standard, if USC can have that level of performance up front under Zach Hansen, all right, then we can really seriously entertain going 10-2, making the playoff, competing at a higher level for bigger prizes. But until I see that USC offensive line operate at a higher level more consistently, not having as many of the ups and downs as we saw last season, not being as wobbly in Big Ten road games, and especially in Big Ten road game fourth quarters, that was a real problem. Not being able to finish games, not being able to lock them down and close them out. Until we see that, right? We need to see it. Like I don't think it's ever helpful to get ahead of ourselves. That game against LSU last season was really good, but it was a neutral field and it was close to home in Vegas. Kind of a different deal, right? Let's see USC go into these Big Ten road environments. Illinois will be, I think, the first really big indication of where this team stands. Let's see the offensive line deliver the goods. And if it really does, and USC can throttle Illinois, like not just scrape by a field goal, but if USC goes into Champaign in late September and wins by 17 or 20, okay, you have my full and undivided attention. Like that would change the conversation, right? And that would change my sense of what's really possible for this team. But right now, I think USC is right there, kind of in a mixture with Oregon and Michigan, and it's mostly a Penn State, Ohio State battle at the top of the Big Ten. Indiana too. If there are Hoosier fans, my apologies. Like I omitted Curt Cignetti, but with Francisco Mendoza quarterback, like Indiana could absolutely be a factor once again. I would say, though, that Indiana's going to have a target on its back. It will be hard for Indiana to replicate exactly what it did, but I do think Indiana is definitely going to be a factor and relevant because I really believe in Curt Cignetti. I think that I don't think Indiana's going to win 11 this year, but I do think Indiana is still going to be relevant, still going to be in the mix, still going to be good. Because I think Curt Cignetti is the truth as a head coach. So that's a first general overview of the Big Ten. But of course, looking forward to what these coaches are going to say at media days. Not in the sense that it has real meaning for what the season's going to be, but I'm going to be interested, not just with Lincoln Riley, but with the other prominent coaches of the top tier teams or the expected top tier teams in the Big Ten. I'm just going to be interested to see, are they going right into the expectations? Are they confronting the challenge? Are they puffing their chests, or are they going to be cautious? Are they going to very clearly try to tamp down the expectations and kind of go, well, we have all these mistakes and we're just little, I don't know if it's all going to work out. And with the underlying point being, all right, guys, and on the practice field, we need we need to see it, right? So the coaches might be motivating. Some coaches might motivate it through projecting strength. Other coaches might motivate through projecting uncertainty. I don't know if we're any good, and so that might be the way to get their players to rise up in preseason camp. So I'm going to be very interested just to see how the various coaches are going to spin their respective situations. Lincoln Riley, obviously, very much included. Hey, folks, so we've spent an hour, And as I wish you a happy 4th of July, I just want to close with a couple notes. So one, Ethan will be joining us next week. And this is just a 1-week deal. There's no big problems. He just had a schedule complication. So he's going to be back. No worries on that front. And we'll talk more about USC 2025 and also the recruiting. The other thing is, because this is 4th of July, hey, be sure to take care of your pets. Yahoos, idiots shooting off fireworks. Make sure your pets might get traumatized, and just care for them as well as you can. Give them a little extra comfort, maybe a little extra treat. Just do what you can to make them feel especially loved, cared for, tended to, because this is a real traumatic time for pets, especially if you lose the lottery in terms of living right next to a neighbor who is shooting off high volume, high sound fireworks. Be sure to take care of your pets, and if you notice other pets in your neighborhood walking around loosely, this is just a time to be vigilant and care for our dogs and cats. People who give us so much love and attention. For those of you who do have pets, let's just take this as a time to really tend to your pet and look out for your neighbor's pet on 4th of July. All right, folks, have a very safe, enjoyable, restful holiday weekend. I hope you just are able to get away from the cares of the world for a little bit. And we'll be here next Thursday night, on USC Trojans Primetime Live, here at the Voice of College Football. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. We will see you next week.